It's always such a pleasure to talk with Dr. Gabor Maté. He has such a wide range of ideas and insights into how our world works. What is it that's putting pressure on us? And one of the things he talked about in the interview is just how vulnerable we are as children, as we move into adulthood, that things are so difficult right now for everybody, and that there are ways to connect. And that if we're watching interviews like this with him and in trying to work with the disconnection that happens with trauma by connecting with ourselves and with each other, that we can really make a difference in our lives and that of other people as well. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Welcome. Gabor Maté is here with us today with the Radical Recovery Summit, and I so appreciate your time and the time you've given to us over the years. It's been so helpful in understanding trauma and addiction and how they all intersect. And one of the first questions I have for you today is, you went from being kind of a lone voice in the wilderness, talking about trauma and addiction and talking about compassion and um, connection and all of those things that really, really affect how we move about in the world. How does it feel for you now to have the Wisdom of Trauma movie out and the interviews that you did, which were so much fun to watch? And it looked like you were having a great time doing them. How does it feel to you now to be kind of seeing the widespread understanding now that trauma and addiction has, and that it's an understanding that you've really helped to form?
In general, trauma has become much more of a subject of interest for a lot of people. Witness the success of Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, recent book by Bruce Perry and Oprah, What Happened to You. In general, there's just much more discussion about trauma. So it's very gratifying to be a part of that wave. And it's only 10, 15 years ago, very few of us were talking about these things. And now there's much more awareness. Now, far from broad enough, far from deep enough, and certainly is really yet to penetrate the medical practice or even the practice around addiction, but in a deep enough way. But it's certainly gratifying to see the movement, and it's good to be a part of it. I mean, what's happening right now just isn't working. In British Columbia, where I live, more people are dying of overdoses than of COVID, and
Wow.
and yet, where's the similar mobilization of resources and public health concern and just sheer rationality in dealing with it? So in terms of government policy and even the medical approach, we're still in the dark ages. So yes, it's gratifying to see the acceptance and the broad interest in this trauma-informed view. At the same time, we've got a long way to go yet.
So do you feel like we're further ahead maybe on the trauma understanding, but not so much in the link to addiction?
I think more people are more aware. That's
Okay.
true. No, in all areas, about trauma and even in addiction, more people are more aware. More physicians, more practitioners, more clinicians, more psychologists are more aware. But institutionally and policy-wise, we're still far behind the curve. I mean, we're far behind the research, far behind the intuitive understanding that a lot of people have. So we're seeing progress, but in practice, it hasn't gone nearly far enough.
Are you seeing any movement in medical schools and in that kind of thing? Are they bringing that research in?
Very little. The average medical student still doesn't get a single lecture on trauma, as far as I know. I mean, I'm not talking. It's not that they should get a lecture; should get a course, and they should get a course that runs all the way through the medical education through all their years. They don't get a single lecture. There are exceptions here and there, but I'm talking about the average practitioner, and so they're just not equipped to deal with what shows up. And I'm not just talking about addiction. In my view, virtually all mental health conditions, and so do most chronic physical illnesses. And that's pretty easy to show. There's an article this morning about in the New York Times. That's what they've discovered. Stress is bad for the heart. And they showed that if you activate the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, that has an impact on the heart. and it may be more of an impact than smoking and high cholesterol and high blood. Now, this isn't new. It's news in
No.
the Times, but it's not news in the real world. The research has been on for a long time. The average medical student hasn't got a clue about that research, linking the amygdala and the heart. And now, of
Right.
course, the more traumatized you are, the more activated the amygdala is. And so that the research has shown for years that men abused in childhood have, tripled the rate of heart attacks, regardless of whether they smoke or drink or have high blood pressure. So, on the one hand, there's this elegant research. The pathways have been worked out. I mean, we know the pathways from the amygdala to the heart.
Right.
Average medical student doesn't get that lecture.
So when we look at, your book, When the Body Says No, and The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and this large body of good writing and research, and all of those things that have been so evident for so long, it's puzzling that the medical education doesn't include more of that. Do you feel like a lot of doctors now are starting to search that out on their own? Same with maybe therapists and that kind of thing?
Well, a lot of doctors are having to, by default, figuring this on their own. That's what's frustrating, though, is that it's like it's a Bermuda Triangle. Like everybody's, the information just disappears and sinks without a trace. You know,
Mhm. Right.
studied 2 years ago from Harvard, the more trauma, the more PTSD symptoms a woman experiences, the greater her risk for ovarian cancer. Now we know the physiology
Mhm.
links trauma and cancer. Average medical student doesn't hear about that lecture, and,
Right.
and they have no idea what to do with it. Now, it's when you say it's puzzling, well, it is. In a rational world, it's puzzling, but we're not living in a rational world. And in the world that we're living in, it's not puzzling at all because the mind body separation is endemic in Western culture. Furthermore, physicians are not taught to deal with their own traumas and their own emotional turmoils. They have, they have very little comfort in exploring those of others. You know, the research that's published in medical journals is mostly about drugs, which is makes sense because who funds the research? The pharmaceutical companies. They have no interest in stress or trauma. That doesn't sell any pills. There's no trauma pill. You know,
Right.
there are pills for the some of the effects of trauma. I mean, what are antidepressants? But pills for the effects of trauma. Suboxone, but a pill for the effects of trauma. So they have interest in the impacts of trauma, but they have no interest in the source of trauma.
Right, and there's no money there.
No money there. So the research that's done reflects the economic interests of those with the money to fund the research. It's just, in other words, it's an outcome of living in a materialist, globalized capitalist system.
Do you wanna talk a little bit about The Myth of Normal, your new book coming out? This kind of fits right into that. Can you describe a little bit about what you're talking about there?
Yeah, just as you say, it goes right along with what I've just been saying. So the argument, and I don't talk too much about the book because it doesn't come out till September the 13th. So, but it's done, and essentially what I'm saying is that what is normal in our culture. Well, let me give you an example, extreme example, but it's illustrative. Adolf Eichmann was the SS lieutenant colonel who was the engineer, not the instigator, but kind of the mechanical engineer of the Holocaust, the genocide. He's the one that came to Hungary and to Poland and arranged for the transport of Jews and Roma and others to the death camps.
Right.
So when he was tried for war crimes, Hannah Arendt wrote a very famous account of the trial called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Arendt reports that several psychiatrists examined Eichmann before the trial, and they all pronounced him perfectly normal. But his relationship to family and society and his parents are all admirably normal. So, well, if that's normal, then what does
Right.
that then what does that tell us about the relationship of health and natural ways of being to normality? In other words, in our society, what I'm saying is in our society is considered to be normal is neither natural nor healthy.
Right.
And what is considered to be abnormal, like mental illness or physical illness, are actually natural responses to abnormal circumstances. So that abnormality is not in the disease, so called, but it's in the culture that generates the disease.
Right.
That's the myth of normal. And the myth fundamentally is that what is normal is natural. It's the way it has to be. It isn't. What is the norm in this society? Not natural. It's not healthy. And so it's making a lot of people sick. And then that extends from the personal to the interpersonal to the social to the cultural, political. So it's a very broad look at normality and how it affects so-called normality and how it affects human health.
Right. So when we're looking at one of the things you've said about trauma is that it disconnects us
Yeah,
from ourselves and from each other. And that seems to be really a lot worse in many ways after COVID as we're moving through the the social distancing, but also just the trauma and the fight, flight, freeze response that people are experiencing. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's going on now? It just seems like things are getting so much worse. There's so much polarization, the rise of authoritarianism, and can
yeah.
you reflect a little bit upon on that?
COVID hasn't caused things as much as it has revealed them. In other words, this has been a fragmented, increasingly alienated, lonely society for a long time. I mean, between 1990 and 2010, the number of Americans who said they were lonely doubled. This is well before COVID. I'm being approximate with the dates, but I'm quite right about
Mhm.
it. The percentage went from 20% to 40%. Now, loneliness is associated with increased risk of disease. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for illness as smoking or obesity, according to all the statistics. Its impact on the heart, on the immune system, and so on. Now, this has been going on for a long time. Nothing to do with COVID. It has to do with um, neoliberal economics and the way that social um, institutions and organizations have become less and less cohesive and more fragmented. People are more on their own. It's been going on for a long time. Britain has gone so far as to appoint a minister for loneliness. Of course, what they don't realize is that the government policies that have undermined
What are driving the loneliness?
the social network are driving the loneliness.
Mm,
Now, so COVID has exacerbated that. COVID has also revealed the social divisions, like inequality. Like the billionaire class has got incredibly wealthy under COVID, and they're by exponentially. There's a lot of people have become impoverished. Now that social division, that inequality, COVID didn't cause it. It revealed it and exacerbated it. And as far as the increasing hostility and fragmentation in the political realm, that's been going on for quite some time before COVID. But again, COVID has exacerbated it and revealed it so that you have this odd situation where people can't talk to each other civilly about a medical issue. That vaccines have become in some people's minds, a major political barrier to communication. And it's interesting. I mean, I know people that work with me, otherwise rational people. In my view, they can't think rationally about the vaccines.
yeah, I know some too.
They can't.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you know, and To me, that speaks to a deep underlying distrust, which I think is trauma based, actually.
Right.
So I think COVID has, and of course, domestic violence has gone up under COVID. More children are showing up in the emergency ward with injuries as a result of domestic violence. But COVID is not causing that. In families that were cohesive and fairly together, COVID has only created more togetherness,
Right.
more functionality. So it all
Hmm.
depends on who it hits. But it has revealed the fault lines in a very fractured society.
So when we look at traumas disconnecting, whether people grow up and they just can't stay present, so they dissociate, or that feeling of there's something wrong with me, it's my fault, all of those things. And then we move into adulthood. And then we have something like COVID comes along and all the economic disparities and racism, everything else.
So there was an interesting article in the New York Times a week ago, Saturday, um, about some town in the U.S. where it's been a big hubbub about mask mandates,
Hmm.
and the people against the masks, they profiled one person. They talked about how she was traumatized as a child, and then she's an evangelical Christian, so that we talk about LGBTQ rights and racial issues. They feel threatened because they have so little to start with. And now they think that these people are threatening their way of life and their values. And they're so identified with an image of a good America that to talk about slavery and racism threatens their self image. And then COVID comes along. Now they can fight back.
Right.
Now they can say, no, you're not going to push us around any further. We're going to assert ourselves and we're not going to have a mask mandate in our community.
Right.
So it's not about the COVID at all, is it? It's about the trauma and it's about the identification with certain rigid self images that now have a chance to assert through this COVID militancy.
Right.
Now, there's been a lot of hostility on all sides in this COVID debate, or rancor, not even a debate.
Right.
Because in the debate, you're listening to other people's point of view, and
Right. There's not a lot of that going on. Yeah.
um, so there's been a lot of judgment by pro-vaxxers against anti-vaxxers. Not a whole
Right.
lot of passion.
It's true. It's hard sometimes because it feels like a threat.
It feels
If
like
they would get vaccinated, I would be less likely to get COVID. So it feels like
right.
a
So,
logical kind of thing, even though it doesn't really
so there's a
stand
natural,
up.
yeah. So there's a natural anger and reactivity there, but not a whole lot of compassion. At least with compassion, it might not change the situation, but at least I wouldn't be walking around with heavy-hearted rancor towards another human being who sees it differently.
So how have you worked with that? You mentioned people that don't seem to have access to rationality around this. So how is it that you can keep your heart kind of open towards them?
I have to work at it. I really do. I see the goodness in them. I see the wonderful work they've done in the world. I say, okay, on this one, we're just not going to agree. But I don't need to. But and you know what it is? I do notice in myself the tension in my chest when I think about them, when I speak to them. Well, that's my problem. And so one of the cardinal rules in the compassionate inquiry approach is whenever there's tension, it requires attention. So when there's tension in myself, I could sort of release that somehow by projecting it on the other person in my voice, body language, in the language itself. Oh, notice, well, this is tension in me. That's my issue. It's not they're not causing the tension. Nothing they're doing is causing my tension. That tension is mine. So that's where I can inquire compassionately into myself. Okay, what's happening for you here? Or you feel threatened, or you feel you're angry that you're not understood, or you just want to be right, or you're grieving the fact that you can't be together with this person on this one, and so that makes you angry. We can inquire into their perspective and where it arises from, but also into our own.
Right. And as you were speaking, it occurs to me that they might be having many of the same thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. Yeah. Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah. I hadn't thought of
Mhm.
that, but of course.
So we have a wider spread acknowledgement that our mental health is not very healthy. We don't have a lot of resilience in our nervous systems. Our mental health is certainly really strained through COVID and through everything that's been going on. What do you see as, and I'd like to bring compassion inquiry into this. So I know that with your program, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but you work with a lot of people who are already in the healing fields, psychologists, therapists, doctors, different people.
Yeah.
How do you see, where are we going to go from here? So many people are telling me they can't even get an appointment to see a therapist, and people are really struggling. What, how does your program fit into that, and how do you see that working?
Well, I don't know how my program addresses the difficulty finding therapists. And the other problem, Lynn, is that um, how to say this? Even when therapy is available, it's often not all that good. How you find a good therapist? I mean, I don't know.
Hmm.
When I was in family practice, um, one of the reasons I developed compassion inquiry, or one of the reasons I began the work that morphed into compassion inquiry, was because when it came to finding specialists, if I needed a gynecologist referral or a neurologist or oncologist or cardiologist, that'd be no problem. When it came to a psychiatrist, I had a kind of a, not a rule, but an observation that there are two kinds of psychiatrists, those that are good and those that are available. And the ones that are good are not available, and the ones that are available are not good. Because the good ones, I'm not talking in terms of pharmacology. Now, a lot of them are good at that. And, I'm certainly appreciate in some situations the value of psychiatric drugs. I've taken them myself. I'm not against it. I also think they're overused, but that's a whole other issue. But when it came to counseling people, they just didn't have the training.
Right.
So the good ones, and of course, once you start counseling people, you get filled up very quickly because spending how many hours a day do you have?
Hmm.
You can only handle a few dozen patients a week at the most, a couple of dozen patients a week at the most, or 3 dozen maybe. So that's what. So it's not a knock on individual psychiatrists, but those that were good were not available. So I began to consult people myself because the people in my practice couldn't afford private psychologists
Right.
or private therapists. So I began by default. I became a sort of a self-trained counselor. So the availability is a real problem. All I can say is that the one thing that is positive is that you can actually find people online. So you don't have to. You can even work with somebody in a different city.
Hmm.
So that's a benefit. You don't have to find somebody right in your vicinity. So even if you're in a small town where there's not a whole lot of choice, you can find somebody online.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good modalities out there these days. Increasing number of good modalities. You know, there's my compassion inquiry, and people are trained in that. There's Dick Schwartz's internal family systems, and Peter Levine has trained a lot of people in somatic experiencing.
Hmm.
Ada Ogden and Janina Fisher, and a whole lot of names that you and I would both recognize. So,
Right.
in a certain sense, the situation may be better now than it used to be, only because the need is great, but at the same time, the choice may be broader because of the internet. So this is where, as much as I train people in compassion inquiry, and I train hundreds every year, and they come from 80 different countries. You couldn't do that in person. This conference couldn't take place in person,
Right.
or people would have to travel,
Hmm.
pay a lot of money. So, in a certain sense, for all the sins and many harmful effects of the internet and the digital world, it does offer some advantages at the same time.
I attended Bessel van der Kolk's online conference last year, which I never would have been able to do otherwise.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. So compassion is the key to being able to really connect with ourselves again. Certainly to connect with each other, but to connect with ourselves. So, what might people who are feeling lonely or just kind of disillusioned about this or feeling like they're really in a struggle and they feel disconnected from themselves? So many people have such an inner critic and don't have a lot of, they have a lot of pushy aggression, but not a lot of compassion and kindness for themselves. So, what are some of the ways that they might open that up for themselves?
And this is where, from the compassion inquiry approach, nothing in one's psychic life is intentionally negative, and it's all there for a reason. And at some point, either that inner critic played a valuable role in your life, otherwise it wouldn't be there. It's, in other words, it's an adaptive function of Dick Schwartz in his family system therapy talks about. He's got a new book called No Bad Parts. So,
Mhm.
like even this dire inner critic, it's not a bad thing, a bad part. I don't talk so much about parts. I mean, I do sometimes, but that inner critic served a function. So, for example, and with some compassion, this is where compassion comes in. Why is compassion important? Because it's in the nature of trauma that puts people in a defensive mode. Now, when you're in a defensive mode, you're kind of shut down and rigid and tense. Not much change, transformation, or learning can take place in that kind of a state.
Mhm.
Only when there's safety present will you relax enough to allow a different perspective to arise. Now, what's required for safety? Compassion. In other words, acceptance without open minded curiosity and acceptance without judgment, along with the desire to help.
So
At
compassion from someone else, you mean?
first, yes,
Mhm.
it's hard to give it to ourselves, although in my new book, I do teach it, but how to, and so that, like, take that inner critic, look at it from a point of view of compassion. Let's take a child who is not understood by the parents, or worse, is being abused. The child can make two assumptions. One is the world is dangerous. My parents don't love me. They're incompetent. That's an assumption a child could make. The fact that my parents can love me and hurt me at the same time, that's way too complicated for a kid. The child's
Right.
brain doesn't have that kind of complexity. So either the parents are bad, or I am bad, and if I work hard enough, maybe I can be good enough. Now, which is the safer assumption for the child?
Yeah. The one that gives them some power if
Yeah,
I work hard enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and the one that makes the parents less dangerous.
Right.
It's unbearable otherwise. So, therefore, that inner critic that says you're not good enough comes along as what I call a stupid friend. Like a friend in the sense that it's there to support you, and it did in the beginning.
Right.
The stupidity lies in the fact that it doesn't learn that its services are no longer needed. So 30 years or 50 years later, it's still singing the same tune. No, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
If you inquire compassionately, all of a sudden, the sting is out of it. So the essence of compassion inquiry really is that there's no aspect of us, there's no dynamic in us that didn't serve some kind of a purpose. And if you're curious enough and compassionate enough, you'll figure it out. And you don't have to keep torturing yourself.
One of the things that I really was attracted to with Eastern philosophy and meditation when I first got involved was the concept of basic goodness.
Yeah.
And it's such a difference between the feeling most North American and Western cultures have of there's something really rotten inside. And if somebody gets to know me really well, they're going to find that rottenness.
Yeah.
And that why wouldn't we want to avoid connecting with that if that's what our sense is? And that's certainly what the culture teaches us.
Well, yeah, it goes way back in Western culture, original sin and all this. Um, but it's exacerbated today because I'm not even talking about religiosity and fundamentalism and evangelism. I'm talking about what is the what is the sense of human nature that this society teaches people? Is that we're being
Mhm.
selfish? Like when somebody does something very selfish, what do we say? Well, that's just human nature. Interesting enough, when somebody does something kind, we don't say, oh, that's just human nature.
Right.
It's only the bad stuff. So we're competitive, aggressive, selfish, aggressive. No, that is our view. And again, this is a chapter in my new book. Again, if we look at it from the point of view of social value, well, what kind of a view of human nature would an aggressive, competitive, acquisitive capitalist system teach people?
Right.
Because it justifies the system. So the ideology of this flawed, I mean, morally flawed human nature, or it's not even a flaw, it's just how we are. It serves the system.
It does.
And the system then generates conditions that makes people defensive and therefore aggressive and selfish and acquisitive. So the system promotes values that it then profits off. So it's self-perpetuating that way. Now, when you actually look at human nature from the point of view of neurobiology and prehistory, what do we see? We see much more emphasis on the interactive and the communal, on the giving rather than receiving, on the nurturing, um, on the belonging. That's what we see, and it's no wonder that when people come to themselves, and literally, I mean, they come to themselves, they find out that there's much more satisfaction in loving than in presenting, much more satisfaction in giving than in receiving, much more satisfaction in belonging than in rugged individualism,
Mhm.
which has got nothing to do with individuality. Uh, so that actually your whole nervous system and your viscera relax when you have those qualities present. When you're in the competitive, aggressive, selfish mode, you're tense. That physiological reaction will tell you what your true nature is.
Right.
But this system thrives off perpetuating the myth of the individualist, split, disconnected, aggressive, selfish being as representing who we are.
Mhm. So if we go back to what you said earlier about with COVID, family units that were basically healthy, where people don't turn on each other, they develop more cohesiveness during COVID.
Yeah,
And family units that weren't, and the rise in domestic violence and divorce, and there's a lot of indicators that that's fractured. That pressure on it really is being hard for people. And so when you look at that, so we have all of these people who are experiencing good enough connection and safety and starting to have the capacity to move into compassion for ourselves and each other and connection. So what about people who don't have that as an experience? What are some of the steps or what's part of their journey to even trusting that they have the capacity to heal, or that it's safe enough to trust a therapist, or
but
to do this kind of work?
here's the thing: we can't talk about this in the abstract.
Hmm.
You only talk about it in terms of individuals. No, an individual who comes to you or to me or even listens to this
Hmm.
is already asking some questions.
Right.
Is already realizing that the way things are, not only, I mean, If somebody believes that everything is miserable and it's just the way things are, and it's just the way they have to be, they're not going to be listening to us. So by the time somebody listens, they may feel despondent, they may feel confused, they may not see the way forward, but at least there's a sense in them that it isn't the way it needs to be, and quite possibly there's a way out. Otherwise, why would I listen to these people?
True.
So that's who we're talking to. And to
Right.
that person, I would say, well, just notice what in you even wants to listen to this conversation. That's the part of you that believes that this connection is not absolute or it's or inevitable. So how can we work with strengthening that part? And what can you do to support that part, that vision in yourself?
Mm.
You've already begun it just by listening to this. If you didn't
Right.
have those qualities in you, or those qualities were totally shut off in you, you wouldn't even be in this conversation.
When you work with people with addiction on Vancouver's East Side, and one of the things that came through too in the Wisdom of Trauma movie, which we're also showing during the summit,
So nice.
um, so that'll be really great for people to be able to see that and see your work and to learn a lot more about compassion inquiry as well. But one of the things that is clear is that there's a community there and that it's a subculture in the sense of not necessarily approved of or accepted into the mainstream culture. But that feeling of belonging and that feeling of other people might shame me, but in this community, I feel at home. That's so important for, well, for everything, for feeling like we're a worthwhile person, for one thing, and to be able to start that healing. So, how do you see that? Or do you have any comments about that?
Well, when I worked there, there was a deep sense of community. So people would lie, cheat, manipulate, and steal from each other,
Hmm.
but they would also care for each other.
Hmm.
That caring would have come through in many, many ways. Um, and especially when a group is ostracized and singled out for special negative treatment, which the drug using community is,
Yeah.
there's more of a tendency to band together just for protection.
Right.
I have to say, sadly though, that I visited the downtown east side a few times since I haven't worked there now for 10 years, but every once in a while I have occasion to be down there. It's even tougher now than it was then.
Oh man.
There's more violence, there's more hostility. The world is tougher for them now.
Right.
It's more dangerous, and
Right.
social policy continues to exacerbate rather than relieve the problem. So there's still that sense of community, but there's a lot more fragmentation, a lot more violence now than there was even when I was there.
Even 10 years ago.
Has to do with the social pressures. I mean,
Right.
almost every class in a society is experiencing greater degrees of dislocation and pressure and stress. That's just the nature of this culture. That's going to tell more on the most vulnerable, and that's what we're seeing.
Hmm. Right. So when we do this healing work around compassion and our own trauma healing, that's really, to me, it seems like that's the real hope. If we can really help people to connect with ourselves, then we don't have that desperate defensiveness and lashing out, and we can have some kind of a genuine connection with other people as well.
Well, when people sign up, we've had about over 2,000 people in the last 3 years taking compassion inquiry. And when they sign up, um, often they think they just come here to learn a new method. And they're kind of shocked into the realization that the first 3 months of the year is actually spent working on themselves.
Yeah. Hmm.
And actually, we have a guarantee that after a month, if you figure this is not for you, you get your full money back and you can quit.
Ah.
Because some people just don't want to do that. And no, out of 250 people, maybe one or two will quit at the end of the first month.
Right. Right.
Um, But that is the approach that the most important work, and that doesn't finish at the end of 3 months. It continues because
Right.
a lot of the time the teaching is when the client is this way or that way. What are you experiencing, and what's happening for you, and how are you showing up? Like the difficult client,
Right.
you even think of that phrase, the difficult client. Who's having the difficulty?
Right. The therapist.
The therapist is having the difficulty,
Yeah.
but the
Right.
label of client. So that means there's something in us is frustrated or puzzled or confused or angry or something. But who needs to work that one out?
Hmm.
We do. So very much the emphasis is on the ongoing inner process of therapist. And compassionate, by the way, not why am I doing this, but
Right.
why am I doing this?
To extending that compassion towards ourselves as well.
So the,
Mhm. Mhm. I find one of the most rewarding things is that just that feeling of connection without judgment or without feeling that disconnection, but to actually connect with other people and have that experience that whatever it is that they're sharing is fine.
there was a study that looked at heart and what can I say, energetic waves that were being released from the heart. There's been a therapist and a client, and they were both being scanned. And when their energy waves were in congruence, they also reported that they both felt better and more connected at that time.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Now, most interestingly, the congruence happened more when the therapist was listening rather than when the therapist was talking,
Right.
which is what you'd predict. But electromagnetic radiation going along with that psychic convergence.
Mhm.
So it's satisfying on a heart level.
When you're working with somebody, and in the movie, people get to see examples of that,
Yeah.
what's going on with you as you're working with somebody? What's going on with you internally?
I don't much engage with myself when that happens. It's pretty intuitive for me. But I do know, but I am aware enough so that if I'm feeling tension, to pay attention to it and not to try and push through it, but to actually sort of relax a bit and say, oh, well, what's going on for me here? But that takes a second.
Right.
There's not a deep analysis at that moment. I can analyze later, but
Mhm.
it's just sort of be intuitively there, being intuitively present and noticing when there's tension and then not trying to push through that by trying to project something on the client. So fundamentally, it's just, but also what's going on for me is I have tremendous trust in the process.
Right.
I just really trust that something's going to happen. I don't have to make it happen. Like, I don't know
Mhm.
in the beginning what's going to happen, and I may not know half a second or half a minute what I'm going to say half a minute later.
Mhm.
I just trust that the right words or the right demeanor will emerge in response to what the client is presenting me. So I trust myself and I trust the client's process that they can handle whatever arises. So I say presence and trust. Those are the and attention. Presence,
Mhm.
trust, attention. Uh, Ideally, now does it always happen? Of course not. But when I'm on my game, if I can put it that way,
Mhm.
those are the qualities that are present.
So if we were to bring that dynamic to a family gathering and you're paying attention and you're present and you feel you're getting tense, that's something that everybody could do.
Well, yeah, and my family will tell you very accurately that I'm a whole lot better at doing this with clients than I'm with my family.
Of course we
Yeah.
can.
On the other hand, I have to tell you, when I'm able to bring those qualities to my interactions with my spouse or my children, it changes the dynamic.
Mhm.
It's much more satisfying and communicative and leaves you with a good feeling. So it's possible, but I'm more likely to be triggered around my family, so therefore I have to be much more aware of myself. than I do in a therapeutic setting.
And so that's a real practice that we can do. And it's so satisfying to have that feeling of authenticity and connection, and that, when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, or we're kind of defending ourselves, that's not very it's not a very satisfying interaction.
Well, we're defending ourselves and very often by attacking others.
So I know we're getting towards the end of our time here. I was just, as someone who's been at the head of the pack here in terms of understanding trauma and addiction and compassion and connection and all of those things, what is it that we're not getting? Like, what is it that you're seeing as things that are still not really being seen clearly?
Again, the question is who's the we? I mean, there's a whole subset of people that are way ahead of the curve. You know,
Hmm.
that subset is increasing. What we're missing is we're still not. We just don't live in a trauma-informed society. The educational system is not trauma-informed. The legal system is, if anything, anti-trauma informed. If I can put it,
Yeah, yeah.
we're like a black hole when it comes to trauma. The medical system is blissfully ignorant of it. Um, what we're not aware of, Lynn, is how vulnerable we are as human beings, right from conception. The states of mind of the mom and the relationship with the parents and the social stresses the family's under, those are already impacting the child. Parenting practices, we so often hurt kids instead of help them in the name of getting the right behavior. And the educational system promotes competition rather than collaboration, um, valuing of achievement rather than valuing of human worth, so that we're just not aware of how vulnerable human beings are and then what our needs actually are. I would say that's the biggest lack.
Hmm. Thank you so much for talking with us. So people can get a hold of you at your website, drgabormate.com, and at compassionateinquiry.com. And you are everywhere on the internet, so people can listen to a lot of your interviews and read your books, and we can educate ourselves. I've learned so much from you over the years, and I
Wow.
really appreciate that.
Thanks for saying so. And yes, and I'm really excited about the book coming out. I was just mentioning that the compassion inquiry training starts 3 times a year. People can check that out. February and May and September, we have 3 cohorts a year. And there's a short course that people can get that they don't have to sign up for the course. It's much less expensive and self-study. And I have all kinds of online events that people can check out at my website as well. So, and thank you for the interview. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
It's always nice to speak to you too. Thank you so much. This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. We have an exciting lineup for our 5th annual, including Dr. Gabor Maté as our keynote speaker. Head on over to radicalrecoverysummit.com to learn more and watch the interviews.